right, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Schoharie Crossing's New York State History Month Tuesday Talk series, and you are here for this wonderful program. And let me introduce the presenter. Ashley Hopkins-Benton is a senior historian and curator of social history and sculpture at the wonderful New York State Museum. She holds a master's in history museum studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program and a bachelor in art education and studio art from SUNY Potsdam. Hopkins-Benton's publications include Enterprising Waters, The History and Art of New York's Erie Canal, Votes for Women, celebrating New York's Suffrage Centennial, and Breathing Life into Stone, The Sculpture of Henry DiSpirito. And so we thank Ashley very much for being with us this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Ashley. It is all yours.
Thank you so much, David, and good evening, everyone. I'm so glad that you're all here. My background and my biography actually explain a little bit about how I got started on this project. So unfortunately, I never got to meet Henry DiSpirito, who we're going to speak about tonight, about his life and his career as a stonemason and sculptor. But I did come to meet him through his papers and through his family, because I had the good fortune of studying at the Cooperstown Graduate Program just after those papers came to the library there. And so I was invited to take a deep dive into them. It ultimately became my graduate thesis and then a book later on. And I'm so grateful that I have gotten to continue to work on this into my career at the New York State Museum. So you can see DiSpirito here in this image in a stream looking at rocks. DiSpirito was a stonemason and a sculptor who was most known for his stone carving. And he was an immigrant. He came from Italy and settled in Utica, New York. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we made the connection and how I ended up talking about this topic for Schoharie Crossing and some connections there. So as I mentioned, DiSpirito was most known for his work in stone, his direct carved work in stone. In direct carving, a sculptor works with a piece of stone and they kind of look at the stone and they see the image inside of it and then reveal it through their carving tools. So you can see in this work of DiSpirito how he saw this squirrel kind of hiding in the sandstone and revealed it through his carving. This is different than when we study the work of, say, the old masters, where they are creating pieces and then they're carved in marble. Those pieces are done in studies first. In direct carving, the artist is working immediately with the stone. And this is a technique that really became established in American tradition in the 1920s. So first, before we really delve into DiSpirito's work, I wanted to introduce you to some of the other artists working in this style. One who was also an immigrant is Robert Laurent. He came from France and settled in in New York City. And these are two of his works, one in alabaster and one in wood. Interestingly, DiSpirito also worked in both stone and wood, so you can see some connections there. William Zorak, also an immigrant sculptor who came from Lithuania. And you can see his human figures here worked in sandstone. And perhaps the artist that DiSpirito has the closest ties to is John B. Flanagan. Flanagan also liked to work in fieldstone, in stones that he found out in nature, just like DiSpirito did, as you saw it in the image that we began with. And unfortunately, there's no evidence that DiSpirito met any of these men or got to see much of their work. But certainly you can see the ties between them and this great tradition that began in the US. So DiSpirito was born in 1898 as Erasmo DiSpirito in Castelforte, Italy. His mother, Anna Riccardi, came from a family of farmers, and his father, Giuseppe DiSpirito, was a stonemason. And DiSpirito only was formally educated up until the 4th grade. And at that point, he left school to become an apprentice to his father and to learn the stonemasonry trade. And I want to point out specifically this work, The Water Carrier, which is now in the collection of the New York State Museum. This is one of his works in stone, done much later in his life, but looking back to his time in Italy and specifically remembering his mother and the other women in the village going down to the fountain to collect water. From a very early age, although he was engaged as a stonemason, DiSpirito felt felt an urge to become an artist. He was drawn to the arts, and he was really engaged with the beauty of the world around him. He was given a chance to exhibit his paintings at a local hotel and restaurant owned by Antonio Coletta. And at that time, his works were seen by Carmine Fusco, a visiting painter, who invited him to become an apprentice as a painter as well. So he actually went and studied with Fusco for a while. But of course, World War I intruded on his life and on the life of Italians and Europeans in general. And DiSpirito was called into service. He served in an office position, but he was really, he felt very hard the suffering of the people around him, the suffering that war brought on, and he was very affected by that pain. Here we have two other works, again, from later in his career after he came to the US, The Pain of War from around 1941 and After the Battle from 1947, both reflecting on his experience during the wartime. He was quoted as saying, "After the battle, no one wins." And you can see that in the battle to the death of the two bulls on the right-hand side. One of my very favorite DiSpirito quotes about war and about the need for art is that he said, "Art is for humanity, not just for the few on this earth. If instead of a gun or toy soldiers, every child were given a brush, molding clay, or a sculptor's tool, this would be a happier world, the kind of world it was intended to be." I think those are words that we can really take from now as well. So after the war concluded, DiSpirito saw the continued suffering in his country. He was out of the military service in October of 1920, and by March 18th of 1921, he was leaving Italy on the Duca d'Aosta to join his family in Utica, New York, and he arrived on April 1st, 1921. Upon his arrival in New York, like many immigrants, his name was changed to Henry, something much more anglicized, more English. And he was put on a train to go to Utica with his destination pinned to his jacket, because at this point he did not speak English. When he arrived in Utica, you can see an image of the New York Central Station, the railroad station in Utica, with the beautiful Carrara marble columns. And he was overjoyed. He saw this stone from his homeland. He saw this grand, wonderful building. And then he stepped out into the streets and he saw that the streets of Utica were still paved in dirt, and most of the buildings were still made of wood. And he had this kind of crashing down of his expectations of what the American experience would be like. But he settled into his life here. He began studying English in night school and continued his education. He really had a lifelong love of learning and spent a lot of time in the library and at the zoo and in other learning institutions. In 1930, he became a citizen. And through this time, he was also working to find work, which was difficult at the time. As someone who was trying to get into trades that were really run by unions, and as someone who was not yet a union member, it was difficult to get into construction, even though he had all of the training from his youth. He worked various jobs in a cotton mill, as a house painter. Working as a house painter in particular was really bad for his health. And eventually he was able to get into work as a bricklayer. Later in his career, he applied for several fellowships and grants to attempt to become an artist full-time, to not have to do this outside work. And I think his application, the text on his application for the Guggenheim Fellowship is really indicative of his feelings about continuing to work but trying to be an artist as well. He said, "The fellowship would relieve me of the necessity of working at my trade as a bricklayer and stonemason, and would provide me with a sustained period of direct contact with nature in the form of both subject and material. Since the start of my career as an artist, my work has been done after working hours on Sundays and holidays. Time has literally been stolen in which to do this work, as I had to fulfill my obligations as husband and father. It is my belief now that now is the peak of my creative period, and I need full time to devote to sculpture. Not only would I use the time to create, but also to make extensive studies into animal and insect life. And these are two more works from the New York State Museum collection, works on paper by DiSpirito. On the right, you have my working shoes, and you really get a sense of the hard work and labor that he was involved in as a stonemason and bricklayer, working in construction. And on the left, you can see an image of Proctor Park in Utica, and some of the stoneworks in Proctor Park are part of the projects that he actually worked on. And we'll talk more about his work in places that became later parts of his life as well. So DiSpirito settled in Utica he met Rose Conti, and the couple married on June 11th of 1927, and they ultimately had 3 daughters, Dolores, Teresa, and Loretta. The family lived in a flat on 729 J Street, and you can see the painting from the New York State Museum collection, Out My Window, shows his view looking out the window of that flat to the factory buildings. And I think this is really interesting, and I'll show you another painting in the next slide. DiSpirito lived almost 2 lives. He was living a life as an artist, really exploring the beauty of the natural world. And then he was also living a life as a laborer, someone who was doing hard work every day, who was involved in the community of immigrants around him who were working in these factories that you see here, and doing hard labor as well. And here's another work by DiSpirito showing the Mohawk Valley and showing the river and the natural worlds that he yearned to be in, but also the factories and the working life that were so integral to his neighborhood and his friends. So DiSpirito got his start into being paid for his artwork by being involved in a WPA project under the direction of E.N. Clark, and this started around 1940. Clark was working on a project to build dioramas that would show the history of the Mohawk Valley, and you can even see we have a canal boat here on the bottom, so little ties to Schoharie Crossing. As part of this, DiSpirito worked with a team making 8 dioramas with beeswax figures on wooden armatures. And these works were first dedicated in 1942 at the Oneida County Historical Society, and now they are in the collection of the Children's Museum of Utica. So I'm not sure if they're open yet, but when they do open, you do have the ability to see these in person still to this day. You know, as a result of this, DiSpirito, whose art had really been focused on 2-dimensional work at this time, decided that he needed some more studies in 3-dimensional work. It was not something that he was accustomed to. So from 1941 to 1943, he began taking courses at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute. And there he studied under Richard Davis, his sculptor instructor. And Davis saw that DiSpirito was a stonemason. He knew this was his trade during the day. And he was the one who encouraged him to try direct carving in stone rather than continuing to work on clay modeling. And that was when DiSpirito really had an epiphany. This was his media. This was what he had been called to do all along. And the two continued their relationship long after Davis left teaching, after DiSpirito had left his studies there. And he continued to seek out Davis's experience and his advice about how he should go on with his career. He wrote to him about the idea of exhibiting and what he should do about exhibiting his work. And Davis wrote back, you know, about exhibiting, I would say this: if you can afford it, exhibit as much as possible. My reasons are that in showing your work and seeing your work in exhibitions with other sculpture, you will grow and improve and get valuable criticism. And we'll see that he very much followed that advice throughout his career. And here is another work from the New York State Museum collection, an elephant And you can see again his knowledge of the stone. This is from a piece of gabbro. One of the really exciting, just a side note, the exciting things about working at the museum is that I also work alongside scientists. So I was able to have our geologist come in and look at all of these works and identify each of the stones. So this piece is a piece of gabbro and found as a field stone by DiSpirito. And you can really see that he just saw this elephant and the trunk and the ears coming out of the stone and just made the smallest amount of marks that he needed to do to get that elephant out of that stonework. Here's an example of DiSpirito's work in wood as well, also in the collection of the New York State Museum. And again, you can see that he really was focused on releasing the images from the piece of raw material that he was starting with, be it wood or stone. I bring up this piece. This is a work also from the New York State Museum, Torso, and it's the only nude figure that DiSpirito did during his career. You can see it was created in 1948, relatively early in his sculpting career, and he seemed to really be wanting to try this subject, and you know, the nude figure was, of course, very important in the history of sculpture. Of course, he succeeded very well, but he continued to really focus on animals through most of his career. Now, in terms of his professional development, another important connection that DiSpirito made was with that of Paul Coonrad. And Coonrad purchased DiSpirito's work from the Monsignor Proctor Art Institute in 1952, and then offered himself to DiSpirito to serve as an agent for his work for free. Coonrad was an author who traveled extensively, especially in New York City, where, of course, many of the museums and galleries were located. And it allowed him time to talk with gallery directors and curators and really get the word out. He wrote to DiSpirito, "I want you to know that I am proud to be your friend and equally proud to be a friend of your cobblestones, who are alive as you to me and part of you. What little I am doing to introduce these friends to the world of art is not work. How could it be? Really, it is joyous and thrilling each time I present them, as I feel the warmth and immediate response that comes from their new friends." So this was a really important voice for DiSpirito to have in New York City, in the New York art world. And soon after, that was really the beginning of him getting into museums all over the state. So Munson William Proctor Art Institute, of course, launched him as a sculptor as he studied there, but it's also where he first exhibited as a student first, and then in his second show, the 10th annual exhibition of works by artists of Utica and Central New York, which was especially important because it was a juried show. So it meant that the curators and the jury really accepted his work and thought that it was important. And not only did they accept the work, this one in particular, Leaping Frog, but they also decided to purchase the work for the collection, and it is in the collection of the Munson William Proctor Art Institute to this day. I especially love this piece because it really shows DiSpirito's study of the natural world and interpreting not only the forms of the animals he was looking at, but their motions and their action. And I just want to go back to almost the double life that DiSpirito was living, because while he was working as a sculptor, had studied at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute, and was exhibiting there, he was still working as a stonemason. And he actually worked on the stone wall that separates the museum from the parking lot. And to this day, you can see his carving of a cat in the stone wall there. It's a little bit hidden, but you can see the ears on the body and the tail. The Cooperstown Art Association was also another really important organization, although not a very big organization. It was one that really gave DiSpirito a lot of support and hope. So in 1947, his work, The Snail, was accepted by the jury there for their annual exhibition, and it was awarded a first place in sculpture category. And the Utica Observer Dispatch noted that it was, quote, typical of Henry DiSpirito's use of animal subjects to express an intense concern with the basic values of humanity. And following that, DiSpirito would be accepted into the annual show in Cooperstown almost every year between 1947 and 1985. And what I think is interesting about this too is the Cooperstown Art Association, of course, helped get his career started. It gave him hope and belief that what he was doing was really good and was going to be accepted. But even though he started to exhibit in much bigger places and move on to New York City, he continued to be invested in that local art scene and go back to Cooperstown year after year. So after tirelessly promoting his work with the help of Coonrad through photos and letters of introduction, DiSpirito broke into the New York City art world in 1950 and 51 with invitations to exhibit in 3 different institutions. After the battle, which you see here, which is now in the collection of the Fenimore Art Museum, was requested in February 1950 for exhibition at the Sculpture Center. And that was a start of another long relationship that he had. DiSpirito's works were later included in a 3-man show at the Sculpture Center and were on view there for many, many years. The director there, Dorothea Denslow, was one of the ones who encouraged him to apply for a grant to the National Institute of Arts and Letters, which he received in 1956, and continued to promote his work for many years until he withdrew his works in 1983. The Ant from 1952, which was in diorite, was accepted to a show at the National Academy of Design in 1984. This is, I should note, very late in his life. This was when he was 84 years old. And this, again, is part of his connection with the Sculpture Center. This work had been on long-term exhibit at the Sculpture Center, and they were the ones who delivered it for him to the National Academy. Lizard of 1950 was invited to the Whitney exhibition in 1950, the annual exhibition of contemporary American sculpture, watercolor, and drawings. And this, of course, is another really important work in terms of major national exposure for him and an important juried show to be accepted in. And I see a question from Hal, why did he withdraw his work? He was getting towards the end of his life. He was in his 80s, and so he decided that it was time for his works at the Sculpture Center to come home. And I think the way that he talks in his letters and the way that his family talk about his work is very interesting. DiSpirito sold a number of works. He gave away a number of works, but he was very intimately tied to them. They were almost like family members. And so there was talk of they needed to come home at that point in his life. Another work that was exhibited nationally. And we have Bang the Moon, another collection from the Fenimore Art Museum, which was exhibited at the Whitney in 1953. And Birds of the Night, made in 1953 and exhibited at the Whitney in 1956. So this exposure in these New York City institutions was really important for him in terms of feeling accepted as an artist, feeling the importance of continuing this work. He did find a couple major supporters and patrons. The Rockefellers, Nelson and his brother David, were both patrons of DiSpirito and purchased several of his works from New York City institutions. But at the same time, DiSpirito was very tied to Central New York. He was not traveling to these shows frequently. He was not spending time in New York City in the art world. He was very connected to home. Another work from his New York City exhibitions. The Grasshopper was invited for an exhibition in 1951 with new talent at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And he exhibited several other works. And this actually was one of the exhibits that the Rockefellers discovered him in and purchased for their collection. So as I touched on earlier, when I read the quote for one of his fellowship applications, the sale of DiSpirito's works were not enough for him to quit working as a stonemason. He was not selling frequently enough. So he also applied for a number of grants through the 1950s in hopes of allowing himself more time to devote to sculpture. In 1954 and 1957, he applied to the Guggenheim Fellowship Program, but was unsuccessful. And in 1956, he applied to the National Institute of Arts and Letters, and he exhibited in a show of grant applicants' works, 3 of his works there, and the show of the chosen artists as well. And what I absolutely love from this, reading through all of his grant applications, seeing the ones where he's rejected and then the ones where he's accepted, is when he's accepted in 1956 from the National Institute of Arts and Letters, that same year, Willem de Kooning and David Smith were rejected. So that is a really interesting side note. DiSpirito continued to work and exhibit in museums across upstate and central New York, as well as western Massachusetts. He had a two-man show with painter Edward Christiana at the Albany Institute. He exhibited at the Berkshire Art Association, where he got an award and got to meet Norman Rockwell, who was one of the jurors for the exhibit. He exhibited at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, the Syracuse Museum of Fine Arts, the Roberson Memorial Gallery in Binghamton, and the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse. And in all of those, not only was he exhibiting in more traditional shows, but he was also participating in lending galleries. And I think that very much speaks to him as a person and member of the community, in that he was really happy to have his works out there where patrons could borrow them for a smaller fee, people that couldn't afford to purchase work to keep in their home, but could have them in their homes for a short amount of time. And as well as the lending galleries from museums, he did also do personal loans to people who requested. You can see here DiSpirito working with some children from the neighborhood. He did very much value the input of children, and he worked often down the street from a school, so the children would walk down the street and have conversations with him. This shows his first workspace in a side yard near their apartment at 729 J Street. DiSpirito found studio places as a place to connect with his community of Utica, and he described his studios as places of life, hospitality, and inspiration. So they were really important to him. He often asked children for their opinions on their way home from school, and he said that the children don't lie about their opinions about his work. Late in the 1940s, he moved into a studio in a garage on Jefferson Avenue in East Utica. It was easier to work year-round there. It was not weather dependent as working outside. The garage was acquired through Alfred Landolfini, who was also from a village near Castelforte, another Italian immigrant. So you can really see the close connections in East Utica with that immigrant community. And this photo shows one of his annual exhibitions that he held in his studio in the garage, held from about 1950 to 1959. And these were open weekends where everyone from the neighbors to invited to come and enjoy his work and talk. Probably the most important exhibition space in terms of DiSpirito's work was the backyard of the family's home on Blandina Street, where they moved in 1958, and they lived there until the end of his life. DiSpirito converted the backyard garden into a sculpture garden, as you can see here, known affectionately as Henry's Garden by friends and patrons and museum and gallery staff who were all invited there. As I mentioned, he didn't travel frequently to New York City or to the other places further afield where his works were exhibited, but he regularly invited people to come visit him in his garden, which was really a calm oasis in an urban environment. And finally, DiSpirito had a studio space at Utica College. In 1963, he was awarded as an artist in residency position at Utica College of Syracuse University by Dean Sturble. And that position was renewed every year until his death in 1995. I mentioned earlier the importance of DiSpirito connecting with youth, and the college students were no different. He really appreciated their conversations, their youth, their ideas. And so he spent considerably more time than he even really needed to at the studio, enjoying the youth and creating. In Edmund Wilson's Upstate, Wilson commented, "We went to see Henry DiSpirito. I thought he was perceptibly changed. I think it has meant a lot to him to have his appointment and studio at Utica College so that he does not have to work at bricklaying anymore. He is having 2 exhibitions this summer, and he has won a prize at Cooperstown. He does not have to pretend to be humble. His face seems even more remarkable than his shock of snow-white hair, more expressive in its enthusiasm and humor. It is as if his stony physique had become with greater freedom more flexible. His wife says that he has lately had a great burst of work. After 60, he is prodigiously productive." Sorry for my stumbling there. But in Wilson's words, you can see the change that this appointment afforded DiSpirito, the ability to focus solely on his sculpture as well. So the studio at Utica College became his primary workspace, and the Blandina Street Garden his display space, and guests were invited to both places frequently. The importance of a studio not connected to home, he said, "This is the place that tells you to do what you're there for, not for enjoyment, but you are here to create new things. When I come here, it's something different. I leave the house. The house is a place where you sleep, but when I come here, it's a place where I work to produce new things." And reading that quote over to myself earlier today, I think that's so important to those of us who are working from home now too, to think about the idea of being able to travel to a dedicated workspace and really focus on that work. So I can very much understand him. And you can see him here working on a portrait of perhaps a student or a faculty member. I'm not certain of this one, but he did sculpt many different people in the Utica College community. And he donated his work profusely to the Utica College community. This work he was commissioned for in 1963 by Dean Sturble and F. Clark Laurie, the business manager. They wanted him to create a work representing the pioneer, which was the symbol of Utica College. And so he spent a lot of time thinking about what the pioneer meant to him, which, as you can imagine, was particularly interesting as an immigrant, someone new to this country who didn't necessarily grow up with the idea of the American pioneer. And he wrote, "I tried to put him in buckskin and coonskin cap, rifle in hands, but I couldn't do it. I had no feeling for him that way. I saw the pioneer as a universal symbol as well as the symbol of Utica College, and that's the way I had to make him. I told the late Dean Sturble a man could be a pioneer in art, in culture, in knowledge, or as he was, a pioneer in education. I found a large field stone that was as rugged and strong as I wanted my pioneer to be. I worked on it outside because when I finished it, that's where it would stand. I tried to keep it simple and make only suggestions of detail." And so if anyone from the upstate community is looking for art to view in this time of COVID and wanting to stay outside, you can see this work on the Utica College campus. The Book of Knowledge was a commission from the class of 1959 as a memorial to Dean Sturble. And of course, Sturble was so important in DiSpirito's life in bringing him to Utica College. You can really see the reverence that he had for Sturble and for the idea of college in general and education and knowledge, all very important things to DiSpirito. The Athlete was completed in 1970. It was a commission of the class of 1970 for the new Harold T. Clark Jr. Athletic Center, where it is still on view today. He carved it outdoors. He placed the log outdoors by the library and asked students to help in this process. So again, I think it's a great example of the energy that he got from being around youth and having their input. The Unfinished Tiger was from 1971. It is from a piece of pink granite, and it's actually a boulder that DiSpirito found during construction of buildings on the Utica College campus. And when he saw it, he saw in it a tiger, and he received permission to use the stone. He began carving it. It was moved to a site near the dorms, and some of the students perhaps requested that it be a panther. DiSpirito began his work on carving it as a tiger, and ultimately the administration asked him to stop. This was, of course, in a period of great unrest. The Black Panthers had recently had their uprising, and there was concern by the administration that this work would be perceived as sympathetic to that cause and perhaps not in keeping with the views of the college. So DiSpirito stopped work immediately. He refused to comment on the piece, and but continued to visit it very often. It was a piece that was really important in his heart. And in 1986, he remarked that he wished that they would move it near the library, and ultimately the college did. And so this too can still be seen on the Utica College campus today. It's a wonderful piece. And on the right is the piece Dodging the Wind from 1982, carved out of applewood. It is a tribute to Utica College students, and DiSpirito wrote, "It was a thing that I see every day. I would look out the window and see the students carrying their books, and I was very sympathetic with them because of how students struggled to get to school, fight the wind to get their education." So again, another example of his the reverence that he held for education and learning throughout his life. And then I also, not related to Utica College, but I wanted to pair this piece from the New York State Museum collection, Girl in the Wind, just to show the repetition of the theme of wind in DiSpirito's career, something that appears in numerous of his figures. Along with his reverence for education, DiSpirito was really interested in great thinkers as well, great scientists and great artists. And so this piece is an example of that. This is Asa Gray. It is made out of cast stone, and it is located in the courtyard of the Gordon Science Center, so perhaps to provide inspiration to students there studying science. DiSpirito was involved in the broader Utica community as well, and this is a work that he did for the Deerfield Volunteer Fire Company, also made of cast stone, made in 1970. And although he was offered it as a commission, they offered to pay him to create this work to go in front of their firehouse. He decided that if he was creating a piece of a volunteer fireman, he wanted to be a volunteer sculptor. And this work is still visible as well. And finally, I want to speak about DiSpirito's work with the blind and visually impaired, which was something that was very important throughout his career. And one of the gifts, perhaps, of the fact that he was drawn to sculpture is the fact that they can be enjoyed by people that don't have sight, unlike a painting. So the Rehabilitation Center for the Blind in Topeka, Kansas, first approached DiSpirito about buying a piece. They wanted it as part of their residence for the people that live there to be able to touch and enjoy art. And he sent a rabbit statue with a stipulation that it must be returned if it didn't meet their needs. And he said, quote, "Beside the sheer enjoyment of the object through manual observation of it, all of us, the sighted and the blind, continue to wonder about the man who can see inside of rocks. What kind of person is he, and what does he tell us through his art?" And I apologize, that was a quote from the director of the center after they received the sculpture. In 1962, DiSpirito participated in a show at the home of a collector in Randour, Pennsylvania. It was an outdoor show specifically for children and for the blind, where all visitors were encouraged to touch and experience the work through their hands as well as their eyes if they were able. And he continued this work in 1982 through A Touch of Sculpture, a show for the sighted and blind at Kirkland Art Center in Clinton, New York, and then through a show in 1992 at the Central Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired in Utica. So these hand-on shows were really an important way of reaching out to this community who didn't typically have the ability to experience artwork, but could in this media. Here you can see the toad, a carving that's in the collection of the New York State Museum. Again, a really wonderful example of how DiSpirito brought those forms out of the rock. And also his studio chair and his jacket that he wore when he was out, either working outside or looking for rocks to make into his works. And I wanted to close with a quote by Eugene Nasser, writing on DiSpirito and other individuals in Utica who inspired the children of working class families in Utica. Nasser wrote, "Henry's example was the most telling of all. The immigrant stonemason with his toolbox, who after a life of work much like that of our fathers, turned late in life to the call of his soul to art." And then finally, I want to tie back in because I'm so grateful for the invitation to speak here, at least virtually, with Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. And when I was asked about what topic I'd like to speak on, so many possible options. I work on diverse history, I work on suffrage history and LGBTQ history. But I decided I wanted to talk about DiSpirito because he had the ties to the Mohawk Valley and to the Canal Way. And so I thought I'd close with this work from the New York State Museum collection, Rock, Sky, and Water, showing that waterway. And finally, I will say, if you'd like to learn more, the book, Breathing Life into Stone, The Sculpture of Henry DiSpirito, is still available through the Fenimore Art Museum, and I think it's also on Amazon as well. This includes the text that I began with for my master's thesis, but it also has excerpts from his daughter Teresa, writing about her father's work and growing up with him as an artist. And it also has his own memoirs that are transcribed in English. So it is a wonderful resource for those as well. I will also add the New York State Museum has a new exhibition of DiSpirito's work, which unfortunately opened immediately before we shut down for the pandemic. So hopefully we will be open at some point in the not too distant future, and you can come check that out as well. And if any of you listening are involved in education or have friends who are involved in education, the New York State Museum education staff is also working on a pair of lesson plans to be used by children in classrooms. One focused on direct carving, which is an art lesson, and that's geared towards elementary students, and one focused on DiSpirito as an immigrant, which is geared towards social studies classrooms in the middle and high school levels. So I hope that you'll check those all out. They will be up on our website, hopefully in the next month or so. And I'm happy to take any other questions if anyone has them.
Wow. Wow, that was fantastic. That was great. And I'll leave a few moments here if anybody wants to put some questions in the chat here so I can moderate those through to Ashley. I'm just going to make a couple of comments and observations. I just think the comment too about him being a lifelong learner is fantastic. I am a huge proponent for the fact that learning doesn't stop when you at 3 o'clock if you're in school, and it doesn't stop once you graduate at whatever degree level that you graduate at. If you don't take an opportunity every chance you can to learn something new, life can be kind of dull. So I like that. And there's actually some references that you've made about his approach to life that actually it invokes thoughts of my father. He was not a sculptor or a great artist, but sort of that Renaissance man in which he could be sitting at the table after working all day at the garage with greasy hands and still quote you something in Latin. So it was really quite interesting. So I can see some of those parallels. So this really kind of connects to me in that level. So there was a comment coming in from Nolan. I'm familiar with Nolan, and he attended Utica. And he states that it's a wonderful description of the pioneer. Having passed it many times at UC, he was always curious why the piece appeared to be rather incomplete. So I think you helped kind of bring that vision to him on that. A few other people's comments about it being a wonderful story, an extraordinary fellow. Nolan also asks, were you able to uncover a bit about how other immigrants received his work? Curious given East Utica's large multi-ethnic community.
That's a great question, Nolan. And unfortunately, no, not too much. From what I've learned from visiting with the family and about what life was like, he really felt like he had two lives in a way, one as an artist and one as kind of a member of that immigrant community and that working class community. So I don't know too much. Obviously, he has the connections with children in the neighborhood and being able to speak with them. And I'd be curious to know, I know that some of his work was featured at the Munson William Proctor Art Institute recently as part of their series on immigrant artists as a way to kind of reach out to modern immigrant communities that are so important in Utica at this time. And I would love to hear if any of those communities made it into the museum and their thoughts on that, but I don't know.
And I will point out, you had mentioned the exhibit at the New York State Museum, and hopefully at some point in the near future, people will be able to go in and experience that. But on New York State Museum's Facebook page and up on their YouTube page is you speaking within that gallery, providing maybe some different takes on those objects. People can see them in a video format instead of just as an image. So I recommend to anybody they enjoy this and they're not doing anything with the rest of their day, they can hop over there and check out some of the great things that you and your colleagues have been doing on Facebook and particularly the New York State Museum's YouTube channel. I made a couple other notes here. You had mentioned, and again, the privilege of being able to work in a place where you also have scientists and people that are familiar with it. Were there any comments so far as the different types of stone and maybe what he saw within that material and bringing out, sort of setting it loose from its raw state? Any indication as to why? Was it just a matter of that's what he had available, or was he kind of drawn to different things for different sculpting when it comes to the particularly the stone?
Most of his stone was found locally. He would be out in stream beds and fields picking up the stone. So I think it's just a matter of where he was collecting and what he found. He was also an avid fisherman, so he was enjoying spending time in those spaces for both purposes. There are a couple pieces. The top stone for the Pioneer was one that was purchased and chosen for that piece. It's a piece of granite from the Adirondacks. But no, I think it's just whatever spoke to him that he found in nature.
Great. I think that's even better, that it was something that he would go out and be able to come across. And so another comment that I was kind of thinking about, or not a formed question necessarily, but with his skill as a mason, not only the technique and the ability to manipulate stone, but it kind of seems, at least the images of the sculptures you've shown, it doesn't really seem like that had a great amount of influence so far as the content of his art. And so I guess that goes back to your commentary on that it was two separate lives. Are there certain things within some of those where you see some level of overlap, where maybe that his work kind of, aside from just the skill with the stone, shows it all?
Not very often. The Toiler's Hand, which I showed early, which I can go back to, is one of the few pieces that really reflects his life. There you go. As a stonemason as well as an artist. It's not something that appears regularly in his work.
Okay. And again, I'll put it out. If anybody has some questions, now's a good chance to put them in the chat. If not, though, I really enjoyed this presentation, and I wrote down that for me, the ant, grasshopper, and the toad were probably, for some strange reason, my favorites. So I hope others are drawn to something and that they've selected a few that they've really enjoyed as well. I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but actually, if you have anything else, feel free to add that. I've really enjoyed this program, and I thank
I
you
want to say
very much.
thank you, David, and thank you to everyone who joined us, especially the members of the DiSpirito family who were able to join tonight.
Absolutely. And I've recorded this. I'm going to hope it renders through, and I'll be able to provide that file to you, Ashley, and hopefully also be able to put it up on either Facebook or YouTube or however we decide to disseminate it. And anybody else that wants to share it can. I think the more people that are familiar with this artist will have a better understanding and a greater appreciation for his work. And it's fascinating. And I wish that I knew this and more much earlier. So again, thank you very much for your time. Thank you to everybody that's tuned in. And we look forward to having you check out some of our other programs from Schoharie Crossing, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.